I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University, and this is Healthy Work. This episode is part of our 8-episode EAOHP Spotlight miniseries, sponsored by a small grant from the European Academy of Occupational Health Psychology. Thanks, EAOHP. Okay, and we're back with another special episode of Healthy Work, our EAOHP Spotlight, funded by EAOHP. And I'm very excited about today's guest, and I just want to get out of the way and let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. I am Marijke Verbruggen. I am a professor at the KU Leuven in Belgium, and I am doing research on careers, flexible work, work-life balance, things like that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. As you mentioned, your research focuses on flexibility around work, in a wide range of ways, how we think about our careers, where we work, whether we work with our pets. I would love to hear more on each one of these. And I was hoping we could start with, what do we know about flexible careers and how that's related to well-being?
Okay, thank you. Careers is actually the research topic that I started when I was doing my PhD. So it's one of the topics that I'm enthusiastic about from the beginning in my research careers. Flexibility in careers is something that has been talked about quite a lot. There was, especially in the years 2000s, beginning of 2000, a lot of talk about boundaryless career, protein careers, which try to capture that there is more mobility in careers, that people make more transitions, and that they also have to take up responsibility in taking charge of their own career. That was also a little bit translated in a lot of policies in countries. For instance, in Belgium, where I'm from, we saw that the government really expects individual people to take charge of their career. They are funding career counseling in the hope that people would take more action and would make more transitions also in their career, in the hope that people can always have a job that they are excited about, that they are motivated for and stuff like that. But we also see that in reality, not a lot of people manage to realize a career transition. When people realize a career transition, it's often in the end positive. So you go through a period of transition, which is often quite stressful for people. But once you are settled in your new job, you're often happy that you made a change, you're learning, you're growing. So that is quite motivating for most people. For people who don't make these changes, especially when they wanted a change, when they actually have a desire for some kind of change, we see that this is quite challenging. People experience a lot of tensions. If you have this desire to make a career change, but you don't go on with it, people often have a lot of problems, issues with letting go of this desire. And it can become very stressful in the end. People become often less satisfied. In the literature, we also call them dissatisfied stayers, partly because they keep on having this tension between this desire, which they didn't act upon, and their current situation, which is not fully satisfying their needs. So in general, my interpretation of the literature and of my own research would be that transitions and mobility and flexibility in careers is often positive if people manage to do that, especially when people are not happy anymore in their current work situation. And if they do not succeed to act upon their desires, or sometimes also a need for change, for instance, in case of an abusive supervisor, that might end up in negative effects for the employee and sometimes also for the organization, for instance, more counterproductive work behaviors, for instance, or lower performance.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. It sounds like an entire body of literature that has answered and asked and generated so many different questions that are relevant, I think, to the way that we talk about our careers and work today, things that are very top of mind. When I was listening to you, things that came to mind were how we've been talking about people changing jobs and switching careers a lot more now than, our sort of stereotypical careers in the 50s where people stayed for 50 years, got the gold watch and retired. And it makes sense then that in the early 2000s, this area of research really took off, and the idea of people taking charge of their careers and changing careers to meet their needs really took off in the research because we were seeing it in popular discourse. And the other thing that really comes to mind right now is as technology advances, as we're pushing for more green energy, there's a lot of industries that are worried about becoming irrelevant, right? People are worried about their livelihoods, their one factory towns, their mining towns, their job skills becoming irrelevant and not knowing what to do next. And what I really liked about what you'd mentioned was the resources that government created for people to help them upskill and train and become familiar with what they do want, that career coaching skills. And it sounds like beyond just individual desire to change and ability to change, right, which is certainly a privilege, having the resources and the environment to facilitate that, to make sure that transition is less stressful, is easier to manage, and attainable for a wider range of people might be particularly valuable. Does that sound kind of like the right interpretation of where that literature is headed or is?
I really like your reflections that you just shared. Let me first respond a little bit to general labor market trends, because indeed we also see that there is this need in a lot of countries, in a lot of industries, for people to change occupations or to change industries, because some of the industries are declining while others are growing. So we really also need this reskilling, this mobility, just to keep our labor market going. So from a more macro perspective, mobility is also something that a lot of countries really strive for and want to facilitate. And then we see, especially in the European Union, that governments are putting a lot of money into help with reskilling and stimulating this kind of across industry and across occupational mobility. When governments are facilitating that, of course, the transition becomes less stressful. But even then, we still see actually across Europe that the mobility rates remain quite limited. So despite all these efforts, we still see that it is not so easy for people to make these kind of changes. Of course, I think there are a lot of factors that play a role, and a change, especially a change of occupation and industry, is a very large change, which requires a lot of effort also from the individual. So that might also explain a little bit why it is not always realized. Well, while these kind of occupational changes are not always realized. At the other side, we also see it's research that we have not yet published, but we are now exploring a little bit. We also see on the side of the recruiters that it's not always easy for recruiters to see how people from other industries or other occupations have the right skills to do a specific job in another occupation. So we also see that on the side of the employers and the recruiters, we perhaps need some initiatives to make employers and the recruiters be more open to people who make these kind of changes, to give them a chance. I'm not sure whether I really answered the question, but so I believe and I agree with you that policy initiatives are really important to reduce the stress, which is typically associated with transitions, especially with large transitions. We also need actually initiatives on the side of the organization, employer, to be more open towards atypical candidates with a typical work experience, but who might have the competences achieved in another way. And in the end, we also need more research to understand why people, despite all the support that there is in a lot of European countries, still find it difficult to make these kind of changes.
Beautifully put. I love that insight, and I'm excited to see where this field goes because, as you mentioned, it's so important. We have increased need from a macro level and then certainly at the individual level. And I think teasing apart why people are not making this change and how we can make that change easier is so important and so cool. I think related to that, and kind of a nice segue, one of the things driving this need for change is technology. And so I was kind of hoping you could also tell me about your research on what role information and communication technology play in the relationship between work flexibility and well-being.
We indeed saw a lot of changes and evolutions in information and communication technology, which with one of the big influences on the connectivity of people with work. So because of all the ICT evolutions, work is close by all the time, that the boundaries between work and home have become more blurred over the years. So, of course, also the COVID pandemic has stimulated this quite a lot because a lot of people were forced to work at home. A lot of companies invested a lot in improving the network, improving the accessibility from home to enable the employees to work from home. And because of all these evolutions, we see that for many people, the home context is not only the home context anymore, but they often keep on working both during working hours, working from home, but also after hours. So people have a lot more difficulties with disconnecting from work after hours. So we are doing a lot of research in our group, both on what is the impact if you keep on working after hours, and also about, how can people disconnect from work after hours? So which kind of little things you can do to make it more easy to disconnect. And we see, for instance, you ask about well-being, that's of course, for some people and at some occasions, it can be good to keep on working after hours because some people, for instance, want to finish a task. And if you cannot finish a task, you cannot get closure and you keep on thinking about the job or the email that you got and you cannot get closure. So if you then can finish the email or can finish the work task, etc., it can help you to finish it and then to relax afterwards. But in general, we also see that especially when people continue to work after hours, day after day, it becomes quite stressful that people have problems with combining their work tasks with their family responsibilities and their family time. Because, of course, working after hours means that you can spend less time together with your family. So we see these effects not necessarily always on a day-to-day basis. So working one day a bit later to finish something or to make a deadline, for instance, that can be actually also beneficial for your well-being. But especially when you do it as a habit multiple times, multiple days, or just always for some people, then it becomes quite stressful, quite depleting actually. So then people will start feeling it in their well-being.
Yes, the nuance of this, I think, is so important. You know, we talk a lot about work-life conflict and balance on this podcast because I think it's just one of those evergreen OHP topics that is relevant to everyone. But one thing that doesn't really come up is that sometimes working a little bit later can be beneficial, or maybe taking a little bit more time with our family can be beneficial. But it's that repeated overwork of constantly doing work on your non-work hours that then we're starting to see these pretty consistent negative effects. I think the temporal level of, are we looking at this at the day-to-day or on average, we don't often talk about in our discussions here. And then also thinking about work-family conflict in that we're doing more work. I think it gets a little bit of a bad rap on this podcast. And so it's nice to have the idea that it's not always the worst. And, it's SIAP submission time here for me. And so I've been doing a lot of extra hours trying to make sure that we're making those submission deadlines. And I can say, on the day-to-day, it feels like, great, I checked off another box on my to-do list. This feels great. But if I had to do it like this all day, every day for the rest of my career, I would very quickly burn out and be over it. So that makes a lot of sense. One thing that you mentioned too here is that those boundaries between work and home are just blurring a lot, which I know, and I'm so excited about this, leads me into another area of your research, which is working with your pets and biophilia. And so could you just tell me everything we know about biophilia and working with your dog or pets?
Let me also admit that it's not my field of expertise, but mainly of my co-worker, Yoni Lelanouye. But it's really excited to be involved in this type of research. So biophilia also means that, or the biophilia hypothesis means that actually we as human beings, we are natural beings and we actually thrive in an environment where we feel connected with nature, with other living things, it can be animals, for instance, like pets, like dogs, but it can also be like seeing nature, working in a park, for instance. And we know in general from research outside the field of work that being connected with other living things is beneficial for how we feel because it's simply a basic human need, actually. So we also saw it in our research on telework, where we actually followed up people who worked from home, both on days that they worked from home and on days that they went to the office. And we examined whether, when you work then at home, whether it makes a difference, whether you are more in contact with living things like having a pet, like having a dog specifically, and having a garden, so being close to green, actually. And we know from research on telework that on teleworking days, there can be some disadvantages. So we have a lot of positive effects of telework as well, like more autonomy, but we also see some more loneliness. We also see sometimes a dip in performance because you are not always connected with people, and also less physical activity. We also, as human beings, we actually also benefit bodily when we can move a lot. And when you work from home, you sometimes move too little. So, and when you have a pet, but also when you have like a garden on teleworking days, these negative effects are less present. So we really saw in our research there are really some beneficial effects from this close contact to nature. I am really not an animal person, or I have no own pets myself, but I learned from my close colleague that there are differences between different types of pets, and we see that having a dog is really one of the pets that has the strongest impact on well-being with people. But let me again stress that I am not an expert in this topic.
That's amazing. The notion that we are natural creatures, that we need to have that interaction with nature really just resonates. My office has no natural light, pretty bland utilitarian walls. And so over the last year, I've been bringing in plants and trying to change the lighting to make it feel like I'm more outside. And I feel so much more refreshed when I can work outside in nature. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And then also the notion that pets are part of this, right? That they're not other living creatures that give you that sense of interacting with nature. And again, I think something that I hadn't really thought about before. And admittedly, I've got cats, not a dog. So I guess my benefits might be a little limited, but they like to work with me too. I think that's just so fun and so interesting. I'm really glad we got a chance to talk about it. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, was wondering if you could tell me about any like major misconceptions you've come across in any of the areas that you've studied. Like as you talk to people who aren't experts, are there just myths that people believe or misconceptions that people hold that you want to take your chance right now to bust and correct on the record?
It's not an easy question, but in general, I like a nuanced approach. I think some of the things that you said yourself, like it's not always all negative or all positive. There are always two sides on the same phenomenon. So I think balance is important in everything we do and also everything we study. Like working after hours, it can be beneficial, but take care of yourself and then be aware of the potential accumulating effects that can happen. I also learned from the research with the dogs that this connection with nature is very important. And because we always think the way we think about offices, we ignore simple things that can make actually an impact, like having a plant in your office. So sometimes paying attention to the things that seem irrelevant might have a lot of value.
I love that. Simple, but really hits home. How did you get interested in this area? In your relatively, it feels like a broad couple of buckets of things that you're researching. What brought you here?
That's an interesting question. It's very interesting that I'm interested in flexible careers because my own career was very stable and unexciting, I would say, because I only worked for one employer in the past, I don't know how many years. Since 2003, I'm working, so that's already more than 20 years. And I never changed employer. Perhaps it's also because of that, because I'm stable myself, that I'm interested in flexibility and change of others, because I am not having that. So I am intrigued by why is it that others have it and why is it beneficial and how can I understand my own inflexibility. Of course, concerning work flexibility, working from home, I think it also started from my own interest or my own experience, like why is it so beneficial or why do I like it, but why do I also like to come to the office? So also again, looking at that different sides. So I was always, I think, in my research a bit triggered by my own experiences and trying to figure out, what makes it valuable and working for me and for others, to see again a bit the diversity in perspectives and try to understand it better.
Beautiful. That is, I love hearing people's stories about how they got here. Has anything surprised you? What is the most surprising thing in your research?
One of the things that I was most intrigued about was one of the things that I also studied a lot, why people do not make a change if they are really unhappy in their career. So that was one of the things that struck me in the data I was having. So at one time, I had data with multiple time points, and I saw that many people who had expressed an intention to leave at one point in time didn't make a change at 6 months later or a year later. So I was really intrigued by this phenomenon. And when I looked at the literature, it was, I think, about 10 years ago, there was really not a lot about this phenomenon. So that was something that I found really intriguing and still find intriguing. So we are currently doing more research on that topic, trying to understand, often also in cases where there are no clear external barriers. So because in some cases, of course, if you're a single mother with 3 kids, it makes sense that you do not change jobs because there are a lot of risks, a lot of uncertainty. But in several cases, people do not have these typical or these external barriers that are hindering them, and still they find it very difficult to act. So that is something that I found really intriguing and that I'm still trying to figure out more.
I want you to find the answer. I want to know. I'm so curious. Which I guess maybe brings us to the next question, which is, what are you doing right now? I know we got a little bit of a preview and you talked about where you're headed, but is there anything else that you want to give us a little sneak preview of where you're headed in your research?
One of the projects that we are also working on is also something that I mentioned shortly earlier in the interview, the side of the recruiters. We are doing some experiments with recruiters to see how they look at resumes of people who have the right skills, who have the right competences, but who did not have the right occupational expertise. And we there see, for instance, that there are some internal barriers that we notice, like they feel anxious about proposing this person to the hiring manager. They fear a little bit for their reputation, for their performance evaluation. They also find it very difficult to decide about this person. So we see these internal struggles within these recruiters to consider these people, which might explain why, in general, we see that these people often do not get a chance. So that is one of the projects that I'm working on, several new studies on telework, understanding to how telework in a team context works out, because that's also something intriguing. We often look at the impact of telework on an individual, but of course, when people in a group, work from home or don't work from home, how does it impact how these teams work and how people may decide about coming to the office or not? Does it matter whether your colleagues will be there? How do they share these kind of things? So looking at more at the interpersonal connections. And then a final project that I'm quite excited about is the role of managers in internal mobility. So I mentioned earlier that people often do not make changes. Typically, I studied changing employers, but we are also looking at internal mobility. And there we had already some conversations with HR and with organizations. A lot of organizations have problems with making their internal labor markets working well because managers and leaders often don't want to let go their talented employees. So they are actually, it makes sense that you don't want your good employees to leave, but at the other hand, it hinders actually the internal labor market. So I am intrigued by this tension between the organization and HR on the one hand and the team, the manager on the other hand. So how can an organization avoid this kind of behavior? When is it perhaps good? When is it bad? So that's also a phenomenon that I'm excited about to dig in deeper in the next year.
I'm excited. I can't wait to see these results. You just teased me. I'm so excited. I can't wait. I think these are really important and interesting questions. And, I have experienced many of those, either personally or indirectly in the real world. And so getting to hear the science behind it, I'm really looking forward to. Which, I think brings us to our last question. Broadly, why do you do this work?
That's also quite a difficult question. I accidentally got into research, I think, but I am really liking to do this job because it gives you a lot of freedom. You can let you guide by interesting phenomena that you either encounter yourself or see happening or see organizations or people struggle with. So I'm quite interested to learn the answer, and I think it's a privilege that we as researchers are able to do that and are able to better understand phenomena around us.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for your time, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you very much.
This episode was part of our 8-episode EAOHP Spotlight miniseries, sponsored by a generous small grant from the European Academy of Occupational Health Psychology. To learn more about EAOHP, go to eaohp.org. That's eaohp.org. Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Resonate Recordings. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher, and our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcatching software you use. And please leave us a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.